This story does not begin with violence or with a crime. It begins quietly, almost harmlessly, with a Christmas party inside a private home where power, familiarity, and unspoken rules shaped every interaction. A gathering meant to celebrate, surrounded by people who trusted one another, people who were used to keeping things discreet, contained, and far from public view. It was the kind of space where problems were expected to stay inside the walls, handled privately, without outside interference. But on that night, before a tragedy that would later shake Hollywood to its core, something was already wrong. The warning signs did not arrive dramatically. They did not announce themselves as danger. They surfaced as discomfort, as tension that slowly spread through the room. Guests noticed behavior that felt off, conversations that stalled, laughter that faded. Some people quietly repositioned themselves across the house, instinctively creating distance without fully understanding why. Voices rose, energy shifted, and what had begun as a celebration started to feel fragile. At one point, someone quietly wondered whether help should be called. The idea did not turn into a debate. It did not escalate into action. Almost immediately, it was shut down. No police, no emergency services, no one from outside the house would be involved. Not because anyone believed something terrible was about to happen, but because no one believed it had to. In a room shaped by power, image, and control, keeping everything contained felt safer than breaking the silence and risking consequences no one wanted to face. By the next morning, 2 people would be dead, and the questions would begin to haunt everyone who had been there. Could someone have stepped in sooner? Did anyone truly understand how close the situation was to breaking? And when warning signs appear in the wrong place, among people who believe they can manage anything quietly, does silence stop being neutral and start becoming a decision with consequences? This is not a story about assigning legal blame. It is a story about moments that feel manageable, familiar, and under control, right up until they are not. The Christmas party itself appeared ordinary on the surface, the kind of private Hollywood gathering that had taken place countless times without incident. It was held inside the home of Conan O'Brien, a setting that naturally carried an expectation of calm, discretion, and control. This was a space governed by unspoken rules, where escalation was neither anticipated nor welcomed, and where anything uncomfortable was expected to be managed quietly rather than exposed. Everyone present understood that what happened inside this house was meant to stay inside it. Nick Reiner arrived with his parents, Rob Reiner and his wife, and at first, nothing about his presence triggered alarm. That detail mattered more than it seemed at the time. Because Nick was not a stranger, because he was the son of a respected figure, his behavior was subconsciously filtered through tolerance rather than suspicion. Actions that might have raised immediate concern if they had come from someone unknown were instead interpreted as awkward, personal, or temporary. The benefit of familiarity softened the edges of what people were seeing. As the night went on, however, that familiarity began to strain. Nick appeared increasingly restless, moving repeatedly through the house, inserting himself into conversations, interrupting exchanges that had nothing to do with him. The behavior was not explosive and not openly threatening, but it was persistent. It disrupted the social rhythm of the evening and created a sense of unease that was difficult to articulate. In response, some guests instinctively shifted their positions within the house, drifting toward other rooms, creating distance without ever explicitly acknowledging why they were doing so. Despite the discomfort, no one named the situation as dangerous. The prevailing assumption was that the night was becoming messy, not volatile, uncomfortable, but still manageable. In a room full of people accustomed to eccentricity, fame, and unusual behavior, there was a strong pressure to normalize what was happening rather than confront it. Calling attention to the tension risked embarrassment, not only for one family but for the entire gathering. Maintaining harmony mattered more than asking whether something deeper was unfolding, and so the evening continued under a fragile understanding that whatever was wrong had not yet crossed a line. As the night continued, the discomfort that had lingered in the background began to take a more unsettling shape. Nick Reiner's interactions shifted from merely intrusive to socially disorienting. Moving through a house filled with well-known figures, he began approaching guests with questions that felt oddly out of place in that setting, repeatedly asking, "Are you famous?" In a room where nearly everyone was either famous or fame-adjacent, the question landed strangely, stripping away the usual social script and replacing it with something harder to interpret. All of this unfolded inside a space where control was expected and where escalation was quietly assumed to be someone else's responsibility. For guests accustomed to eccentric behavior, this crossed a subtle but important threshold. The issue was no longer awkwardness alone, but the sense that Nick seemed unsure of how to situate himself within the room and the people around him. The repetition of the question unsettled conversations, pulling focus and creating moments of visible confusion. It was not threatening in a direct way, but it carried a sense of instability that people felt without fully understanding. What should have been light social exchanges, instead, became moments of tension where no one quite knew how to respond. Despite this, the same pattern held. No one confronted him directly. No one stopped the night. Familiarity and status continued to act as a buffer, dulling reactions that might have been sharper in any other environment. Guests quietly adjusted again, drifting farther apart, lowering their voices, exchanging glances that acknowledged something was wrong without ever saying it aloud. Behavior that might have been confronted in anyone else was still being absorbed, reshaped by familiarity and status. Quietly, some guests began to wonder how far the situation might go if nothing changed. What was happening was not chaos, but erosion. The boundaries that normally govern social behavior were thinning, and yet the group held on to the belief that things were still under control. In a setting where harmony was prized and disruption carried consequences, the discomfort was absorbed rather than addressed. By the time voices would rise later in the evening, the groundwork had already been laid, not by a single moment, but by a series of small decisions to wait, to normalize, and to hope the situation would resolve itself without intervention. The tension that had been quietly eroding the evening eventually surfaced in a way that could no longer be absorbed through glances or repositioning. Voices rose. What had been contained within awkward interactions broke into a public confrontation as Nick began yelling at his parents, loud enough for nearby guests to freeze where they stood. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The room fell into an uneasy stillness, not because anyone was surprised, but because everyone recognized that something private had crossed into the open. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted from discomfort to alarm. This was no longer behavior that could be reframed as eccentric or brushed aside as social clumsiness. It was raw, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Some guests later recalled the instinctive thought that followed almost immediately that this might be the point where outside help was necessary. The idea did not spread through the room. It was not voiced loudly. It appeared quietly, in a whisper, as a possibility rather than a demand. But just as quietly, that possibility was shut down. According to those present, it was made clear that no one was calling 911 and that law enforcement would not be entering the property. The decision was not framed as denial or indifference. It was framed as control. Allowing emergency services to arrive would have transformed a volatile moment into a public spectacle within minutes, drawing attention that could not be undone. In a house defined by privacy and reputation, that outcome felt unacceptable. The night did not end there, but it never recovered. The confrontation subsided without resolution, leaving behind a heavy silence that clung to the rest of the gathering. Guests remained, but the sense of celebration was gone, replaced by a collective awareness that something serious had just been narrowly contained. The decision not to involve outside help would later become a focal point of scrutiny, not because anyone believed the outcome was predictable, but because it marked the moment when control was chosen over interruption and silence over intervention. When the party finally wound down, there was no dramatic ending, no clear resolution, and no sense that anything had truly been settled. People said their goodbyes and left the house carrying an unease they could not fully explain. The confrontation had passed, but nothing about it felt finished. What lingered was not relief, but a quiet tension. the sense that something serious had been narrowly contained without ever being addressed. Later, investigators would confirm a detail that would become impossible to ignore. There were no 911 calls placed from the house that night, no record of emergency services being contacted, no official intervention at any point between the confrontation and the family leaving the party. At the time, this absence meant little to those involved. The night had ended without visible disaster, reinforcing the belief that whatever had gone wrong had been managed well enough to move on. But absence has weight. The hours that followed the party now sit under intense scrutiny, not because anyone could have predicted what would happen next, but because they represent a dangerous kind of silence. The space between the confrontation and the early morning hours became a gap filled only by speculation, hindsight, and unanswered questions. What conversations happened after the guests left? What was said on the drive home? What emotions were carried forward without witnesses? By the early hours of the next morning, the situation had escalated beyond anything imagined at the party. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, were found dead inside their home. Authorities moved quickly, and their adult son, Nick Reiner, was arrested soon after, facing multiple charges connected to their deaths. The investigation would point to events unfolding shortly after the family returned home, transforming what had felt like a contained crisis into a tragedy with irreversible consequences. In retrospect, the night at the party became impossible to separate from what followed. Not because it offered clear answers, but because it marked the last moment when outside intervention might have been possible. The lack of a phone call, the choice to let the night end quietly, and the belief that things had not yet crossed a line would all be re-examined under a harsher light. The question was no longer what happened, but whether the silence that followed the confrontation had allowed the worst to unfold unchecked. As the story moved beyond the night of the party, a new debate began to take shape, one that refused to offer easy answers. Mental health experts urged caution against oversimplifying what had happened, emphasizing that visible instability does not automatically translate into predictable violence. Many pointed out that moments of emotional volatility are common, even alarming ones, and yet the vast majority do not end in catastrophe. The presence of warning signs, they argued, does not grant certainty, only hindsight. Former law enforcement voices echoed a similar complexity. Calling the police, they noted, does not guarantee safety, especially in emotionally charged situations involving family dynamics. Intervention can escalate as easily as it can de-escalate, and outcomes are never assured. From this perspective, the absence of a 911 call could not be framed as a clear failure, only as one of many possible decisions made under pressure, without the benefit of knowing what would follow. Yet even within these cautions, an uncomfortable tension remained. The discussion was no longer just about whether intervention would have changed the outcome, but about how decisions are made when uncertainty collides with responsibility. At what point does discomfort become concern? When does hesitation turn into avoidance? These questions lingered precisely because no single moment could be isolated as the turning point. The night unfolded through a series of choices, each one small enough to feel defensible, yet together forming a path that could only be traced clearly after the fact. This ambiguity is what has kept the case from settling into a simple narrative. It resists the comfort of blame and denies the relief of clear moral resolution. What remains instead is a broader reckoning with how people respond to instability when it appears in familiar settings, among familiar faces. Not with certainty, but with silence, normalization, and the hope that whatever feels wrong will resolve itself before it demands action. As the investigation expanded, attention began shifting away from speculation and toward reconstruction. Detectives started reaching out to people who had attended the party, asking them to recount what they had seen, what they had heard, and what they had captured, if anything, on their phones. Photos, videos, and text messages that once felt insignificant were suddenly treated as potential evidence, fragments of a timeline that investigators hoped could bring clarity to a night now defined by uncertainty. At the same time, rumors began circulating that not everything from that evening had surfaced publicly. Sources close to the probe suggested that investigators believed someone may have recorded a moment that could significantly reshape the understanding of how intense the situation had become before the family left the party. No such footage has been confirmed, and no material has been released, but the mere possibility introduced a new layer of tension. The story was no longer just about what people remembered, but about what might still exist, unseen and unexamined. This uncertainty fueled a rapid escalation in media coverage. Entertainment outlets and online forums raced to assemble timelines, replaying reported details and debating their significance. Some framed the party as a missed opportunity for intervention. Others warned against turning hindsight into accusation. The absence of definitive evidence allowed multiple narratives to coexist, each shaped as much by emotion and speculation as by fact. What had begun as a private tragedy was now unfolding under relentless public scrutiny. For those who had been there that night, the pressure intensified. Memories were re-examined. Casual decisions were replayed with new weight. Silence, once a tool for maintaining privacy, became something to be questioned. The investigation was no longer confined to court filings and police reports. It had spilled into the cultural conversation, forcing a wider reckoning with how stories like this are constructed, contested, and consumed. As media coverage intensified, attention began shifting toward voices and moments from the past, re-examined through a darker lens. Old interviews, conversations, and fragments of dialogue involving Conan O'Brien resurfaced, not because they offered direct answers, but because they now carried a weight they never had before. Words once spoken in neutral or reflective contexts were replayed and reframed, their meanings subtly altered by the tragedy that followed. The same sentences that once felt personal or philosophical were now interpreted as foreshadowing, whether they were meant to be or not. During this period, Conan O'Brien remained largely out of public view. Appearances were skipped. Projects were paused. Friends described him as shaken and withdrawn, struggling to process how an evening meant to bring people together had become tied to such irreversible consequences. It was not silence born of strategy or calculation, but a retreat marked by shock and grief. Those close to him emphasized that he had not been accused of wrongdoing, yet the gravity of association alone was enough to reshape how his absence was perceived. Beyond any single individual, the impact rippled outward through Hollywood itself. Private gatherings were quietly canceled. Conversations about security, boundaries, and responsibility began happening behind closed doors. Industry figures spoke in hushed tones about how quickly situations could escalate when warning signs were minimized for the sake of comfort or reputation. The illusion of control that often defines elite spaces showed visible cracks, replaced by a growing awareness that familiarity does not guarantee safety. What emerged was not a unified narrative, but a collective unease. The story had moved beyond the facts of the case and into a broader reckoning about how power, privacy, and silence interact when real crises intrude. Each pause, each refusal to comment, and each delayed response added tension rather than resolving it. Hollywood was no longer just watching the investigation unfold. It was confronting the uncomfortable realization that the systems designed to keep things contained can also allow them to unravel unseen. As the case continued moving forward through the legal system, its cultural impact was already taking on a life of its own. What lingered was no longer just a sequence of events, but a pattern that felt uncomfortably familiar to those who had spent years inside elite spaces. A pattern where troubling behavior is noticed, discussed quietly, and ultimately minimized because addressing it openly feels more disruptive than enduring it. The story exposed how easily warning signs can be absorbed into normalcy when stability, reputation, and access are at stake. Industry veterans began speaking privately about a deeper issue that extended far beyond this one night. A culture where discomfort is often reframed as personality, volatility softened into eccentricity, and intervention delayed until consequences make silence impossible to defend. These are not decisions made out of cruelty or neglect, but out of habit, out of systems that reward calm surfaces and punish disruption. In that context, silence becomes less a failure of awareness and more a learned response. What made this case especially unsettling was how ordinary the steps toward tragedy appeared in retrospect. No single action felt decisive. No moment announced itself as the point of no return. Instead, the night unfolded through small accommodations and quiet rationalizations, each one understandable on its own. Only later did those moments align into a trajectory that could no longer be ignored. The warning embedded in that realization is not about blame, but about proximity, how close irreversible outcomes can exist to spaces that feel safe, familiar, and controlled. This is why the story continues to resonate, not because it offers clear villains or clean conclusions, but because it forces an uncomfortable recognition that systems built to protect privacy can also shield risk. That silence, while often intended to preserve peace, can carry weight long after the moment passes. And that the hardest truths rarely announce themselves with urgency. They arrive quietly, asking to be noticed long before anyone is ready to listen. As this case continues moving through the courts, one reality remains unchanged. No timeline reconstruction, no leaked detail, and no future testimony will ever restore what was lost. What remains instead is a lingering unease, not because the answers are hidden, but because they are incomplete by nature. Some questions cannot be resolved by evidence alone. They live in the space between intention and outcome, between what felt manageable and what proved irreversible. This story is not about condemning individuals or assigning certainty where none exists. It is about recognizing how fragile control can be, especially in spaces designed to feel insulated from consequence. The night did not collapse under a single decision, but under a sequence of quiet judgments, each made with the belief that things were still under control. In hindsight, those moments align into a warning that is difficult to ignore, precisely because it offers no simple solution. What lingers most is not the spectacle of tragedy, but the silence that surrounded it long before it became visible. A silence shaped by familiarity, reputation, and the hope that discomfort would resolve itself if left undisturbed. That silence does not belong to one house or one industry. It exists anywhere people hesitate to intervene because doing so feels disruptive, risky, or unnecessary. If this story leaves anything behind, it is not a verdict, but a question. When warning signs appear quietly, in places that feel safe and among people we trust, how do we decide when silence stops protecting peace and starts protecting risk? There is no easy answer. But the cost of asking too late is something this story makes impossible to forget.